But I'll get this retard gear train in place, self-timer rather. It's awkward to get into position. And today, for reasons best known to itself, it's giving me more trouble than usual. Just run that down a bit, see if that'll help me. I'm running out of room to drop this in. No, not today. Usually it's not so much of a fight. So I don't do many of this particular shutter. Oh, look at that, it's going to drop down into position, finally. Not sure what was behind all of that. Normally it goes in without a murmur. There must be some piece of it is just slightly off, I'd say. Let's see if it runs down smoothly. Oh yeah, it sounds pretty good. That sounds very good. Tighten that screw up. Okay, we can check the running of the shutter now. So I will cock the shutter. It is cocked. We'll set the self timer. Release the shutter. Okay, it's now hanging on the self timer. We run the self timer down by holding this pin back. The shutter should fire. That's pretty good. Shutter seemed a bit quick for 1 second. I'm going to adjust that speed train in slightly, I think. It sounded better. Okay, well with the shutter at that stage I can close it up and test it. So what do we want? We want the pinion in this curved rack arrangement that moves the pinion, well it's moved by the pinion. Right, so I usually wipe once around the inside and around the outside edge with molybdenum paste. And then I've got to get this hooked in position. Now that hook has to go in behind that tab on the self timer. As I said, it's awkward to get that positioned. They just occasionally will make a liar of me. It's gone in without a murmur there. The timing here. I'll zoom you in for this so you can see that timing. This is critical. Yeah. The timing of these teeth. It's critical that you get this right. Otherwise the shutter's just not going to work properly. I'm going to put the speed settings cam plate in place. It's going to run a little bit of molybdenum paste over this top edge here because that's where it tends to rub. Okay, so here's our plate. This is the tab sticking up as the top side. This is the underneath side. I'm going to run some molybdenum paste over those detents there because they rub on that case. Here, once around the inside, once around the outside with molybdenum paste, taking particular note of these lumps and bumps of the speed setting cam. That's all that's required. You can see there's not a lot on there. If I fit this in place, like that, that's sitting correctly. Put the retaining ring in place and the shutter's complete and should test well at that point. Right, well this tool will cock the shutter for us. Did I put everything back? No, I didn't. I was going to say that will cock the shutter for us, but it would only do that if I had put everything back where it came from. And I haven't. So let's get this retaining ring back off. And this very important piece needs to go in. This is the latch that will hold the shutter cocked. Now we're ready to go. So I cock the shutter, set it to an 1/8. Let's see what we get. That's too fast. So I need to move that speed cam, the retard gear train, inwards for greater engagement with the cam. And I can tell that's too fast from experience. Ooh, that might have moved it a little too far. Let's find out. That's an 1/8. Yeah, that's credible. Okay, I'm going to go away and test that. See what the speed actually reads on the timer. But that sounds credible. I'm just looking at the state of the pin here that couples with the speed with the cam. I'm looking at its angle to see which way it's bent. They're frequently bent to adjust the speed. I can see it's bent outwards. That would tend to slow the shutter down. Okay, I'm going to go away and test this on my speed tester and I'll report back after I've got it running nicely. Oh, the speeds are good. I tested that. That's all very good. I'm just going to try the self timer and we'll see how it goes. I'll set it to a second. Self timer's running down. Blades are still closed. there you go. And that shutter is ready for fitting to the front plate. Right, well there's the front plate all cleaned and ready to go. I'll put this baffle in place. It only goes in one position. There's a pin right here next to this detent spring. That's where the fork on here sits. Now where that detent spring is, we've got to put the ball on there, so I'll put a touch of molybdenum paste on there, which serves two purposes. It's a great lubricant, but it'll also just hold that ball in place while we get everything else in where we need it to be. This little pinion, that goes on this post here. Just give that a touch of molybdenum paste. Now one side of this is hollowed out, that goes, or recessed, that goes down over there. And now the shutter can go on. Before I put that on there, I'll take some molybdenum paste and run it over these detents here for the shutter speed setting. And then this only goes on in one spot. There's a little tiny groove here which fits over the pin of that sticking up right there. So see if I can get this lowered into position without disturbing anything. And I'm going to cock this to make sure the pinion's engaged. Yeah, that's the pinion engaging then. So that's going nicely. And there are 3 screws that hold this from the back. I'll get one in there. I'm only doing it up lightly because that plate at the front of the shutter has to fit neatly over the centre of the lens tube, and it's inclined to not line up. So I just want this held on. So I can turn this over and look. Yeah, and there it is. It's not quite centered up here. If I give it a push, yeah, it just clicked into place. Now I can do those 3 screws up tight. If I'd tried to tighten them up beforehand, we'd only just end up distorting something. I can check that the shutter speed detent works. Yep, I can feel that clicking nicely. And the last of the screws goes here on the side. Doesn't look like the right screw to me. I'm normally looking for one with a rounded top, so what have I got there? Yeah, this is the one we want. Now that's interesting. I wonder whether somebody done a swap on that. I'll have to look back through the video and see exactly what I took out of there. This one's got a slightly rounded head. That's how I picked that it was different. Okay, well that's all together, and I should be able to cock and fire the shutter from here still. This tab would open and close the blades for viewing once the shutter's cocked. That looks good. I better clean up this front plate. And all I've got to do here is swab this with a bit of naphtha. Make sure I remove any traces of old grease and so forth, and any dust and dirt that it's picked up in the meantime. And mostly removing the old grease is important, because the old grease tends to have gathered up dust over time. It's a great magnet for dust. Well, dust is often very abrasive its nature, depending of course on your environment. And so grease becomes a grinding paste after a while, once it's gathered up enough abrasive particles from the environment. So it's always good to get rid of the old grease and put some nice fresh grease there. Okay, that's good. It's get rid of those threads of cotton. We'll see if this will go in place. I may have to remove that insulating washer where the flash contact comes through yet. I'm not sure. Or I might not. Oh, there my... Let's just see if this will cock and fire. I think my release isn't sitting in the wrong place. It is. Now let's try that. That's better. Okay, so that's all good. My flash contact is sticking out through the insulator nicely. So I can put the 4 screws in that hold the shutter assembly to the front plate. It's not uncommon for 2 of these screws to be a bit mutilated looking from people poking in at the lower positions where they can't see what they're doing. And so it's usually best to have the 2 best screws down here where you can't see what's happening, where you're only working by touch, and have the 2 damaged screws, if they're any damaged at all, at the top where you can see exactly what's happening with your screwdriver and the placement of such. These screws are all in good condition. Okay, so that's all good. So that's all back now. Our shutter is back on the front plate, and I can start reassembling the components to this front plate. I'll start with the shutter release here, I think. We'll need its spring and the 2 screws. One of the screws forms a post that the spring binds to. Alright, I'll just clean that with a bit of naphtha. As you can see, you cut through ridiculous numbers of cotton buds or Q-tips doing a job like this, which is fine. They're cheap enough and they come 200 to a box, so it's no real handicap. Just means you're throwing away stuff all the time. Okay, so I'll rub a bit of molybdenum paste on that front surface and then the slots, and if you can't see much on there, that's because there isn't much on there. You don't need much. Put that into position. This shoulder screw goes in this position, the lower position, and the one that forms the spring post goes in the upper position. Tighten those 2 up. And hook the spring into position. And that's the return spring for our shutter release, as you can see on the front plate there. So that's all looking remarkably good. I'm always suspicious when things are going very smoothly, because that's not the way the world normally works. Okay, I'll clean up the components we're putting back here. Okay, let's start putting some of this stuff back together. I'll start with the, what am I starting with? Let's get my act together here. Alright, we'll start with this piece. Now I'll wipe some molybdenum paste on the edge of that cam there, because that's where it picks up the arm that opens the blades. Pop that in place there. Swing that back round to the post. Now this little pinion here, it's got a little tab on one sticking up on one surface. This is what goes on there. That little tab engages with that cam. Get that on there. Rotate it till the cam the tab drops in. That looks good. There's a tiny shim washer goes on there, which I've just put some molybdenum paste on. And that whole business is held down with this spring with a short black screw. This pinion's got a D-shaped hole in it, and that couples with that shaft sticking out that we've been cocking the shutter with. Now the raised tubular piece on the there that goes up. Here is the rack. Now I'm just going to wipe both surfaces of that with molybdenum paste lightly. And put that in place. The timing of this is important. This cam right back against its post at the top there. The tooth on the little pinion should engage with the 5th notch here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There. And this pinion down here should be engaged in the 1st notch. That looks right. This plate, I'm going to wipe some molybdenum paste around the inside of that hole there. That's where that pinion's going to run. We've got 2 spacer washers that go here and here, and this piece goes on. That raised portion of that pinion comes through the front plate there, and that's its bearing, I suppose you could say. Let's run these 2 screws in. Do those up tight. We've got this gear and its little bush that runs through the centre of it, so I'll run some molybdenum paste through the centre of that, put it on the bush. Now one face of that gear is dead flat, the other side's got a ring on it. You can see a raised ring. The raised ring should face to the front, plane surface to the back. That sits right in here. This arm, I'm just going to apply a bit of molybdenum paste to that. That goes that way up. That rod goes underneath it, so that goes on that surface of that pinion. Give that a light wipe of molybdenum paste, and once through the pivot here too for good measure. And this, I've got to get that hooked into place there without snapping the plastic insulator off the front of it. That went without a murmur. It's always suspicious. Get this pulled down into position and get the screw through there. Now that shoulder screw is not always easy to get that seated, but it went nicely that time. And I've got to test the shutter now, so I'm going to put a pinion in there, the cam in there. Let's just see if that shutter runs. Right, closed down. Now at this point in the cycle, the capping plate would come up, hit this lever, the action would continue, and the shutter would run and fire. Now we put some tension on this spring. That'll help that run down. I haven't got any tension on there. Let's see if we can get that done running a bit better for you. Not about a turn of tension on there really. About that. Right. That's better. Okay, so that's all working fine. I've got to solder this wire back on here, so I'll go and do that. And then there's a few finishing jobs, and then put this back on the camera. Right, well, this little mirror buffer needs to go back in place, so I'll just put some adhesive on that and get it in place. We won't need much. That should be plenty. Right, get that into position. That seems to be fine. Okay, one more job here. Where that nice bright solder spot there is, I need to cover that up with a little bit of black paint. Just like that. And that is the shutter ready to go back onto the camera body. So preparing the camera body for the final leg of the journey is the next thing to do. Well, I want to put a bracket on here to hold the spring on the front of the cam, so I need to do that for a start.